Thus far, we have looked at some of the themes of journey in the rule of Benedict, especially in the prologue. We have said that to be a monk is to be someone with a deep, compelling desire to know God more deeply, to be transformed into the image and likeness of Christ. We took a look at the history of the earliest monastics, their journey to the desert to train themselves in asceticism, to become spiritual athletes. Next, we spent some time looking at images for the goal, or more accurately, the objective of the journey. We said that purity of heart, to see God, to dwell in God's tent, to know God in an experience of contemplative union, is what the spiritual journey is ultimately all about. Up to this point, we have looked at how other people have understood the spiritual journey, how the early monks understood what they were working toward, how Benedict understood the journey of monastic life. Now, we will begin to use some tools to better understand our own journey. This is really the heart of this whole program, these 9 months. The purpose is not to come to an intellectual understanding of Benedict and monasticism. The purpose is for each one of us to better understand and live out our own journey, the way in which God is uniquely speaking to each one of us. In addition to these talks, the readings and discussion questions, you will be invited to spend a lot of time reflecting on what your own spiritual journey has been like so far, how your relationship with God has grown and changed, and where you are being led now. As we begin to look at how the insights of modern psychology can help us understand the spiritual journey, I'm going to introduce a schema or model that we will use over the course of this program to help us better understand this journey of monasticism. This model comes from the insights of a contemporary French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who said that a common pattern in Scripture is the movement from orientation to disorientation to new orientation. Some of you may be familiar with the work of biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann and how he has used this schema in studying the Psalms. We will come back to his work later in the program when we study the Psalms. For now, the important thing is to begin to look at how this pattern of orientation, disorientation, new orientation has manifested itself in your life. When we start to see our life patterns in general, we can then begin to see how these patterns are present in our faith life, in our spiritual journey. A key element of understanding these movements of orientation, disorientation, new orientation is the idea of a crisis. We have all lived through various crises in our lives, some big, some small, and we know that they are simply an inherent part of life. What we may not have thought about is the idea that we seldom make any progress or growth in our life without being pushed by some kind of crisis. We probably know this intuitively. As an example, for most of us, adolescence had a lot of elements of crisis. We struggled with our sense of identity, independence, competence, but only through the struggles, the crisis of this period of our life, were we able to come to full, mature adulthood. With this in mind, let's take a look at the idea of life stages and see how to look at the movements of our lives. A famous contemporary psychologist, Erikson, did some of the foundational work that many people have built upon. He said that throughout our lives we grow and mature through various stages, from birth to death. We are used to the idea that children grow and mature and go through stages, but Erikson explored the idea of adult development, that we don't reach adulthood fully formed. Instead, we go through changes and stages from our early 20s to old age, just as we had through infancy and childhood. Erikson also introduced the idea that there is a necessary crisis, or perhaps we could say necessary task, that we have to accomplish at each stage of our life. For example, Erikson said that the task or crisis of the infant is to navigate between trust and distrust. The baby must learn that he or she can trust that the adults responsible for her care are trustworthy and can be counted on to provide for all her needs. If the infant does not experience trust at this stage, then it is likely to struggle with fundamental psychological problems throughout the rest of life. Since we are all adults and are looking at our own journeys, we don't need to look at the early stages of childhood development. Let's begin with the developmental crisis of the adolescent. Erikson calls this a crisis of identity versus role confusion. At this stage, we have to determine who we are going to be. What kind of person do we see ourselves as? This is where we may begin to rebel against the expectations and identities that we have from our family, and begin to try on new ways of being and understanding ourselves. We navigate this crisis when we come to a healthy sense of who we are in relationship to and increasingly independent from our family. If someone doesn't successfully go through this crisis, they may continue to have ongoing trouble with making life choices, having a stable sense of identity, and other issues. In young adulthood, we face the challenge of intimacy versus isolation. At this stage of life, from approximately 18 to 40, we need to learn how to develop and maintain healthy relationships. For most people, this involves dating, marriage, or committed relationships. Although work and school may take up much of our time and energy during these years, Erikson says that the task of learning effective interpersonal skills is the foundation of future maturity. As we grow older, the transitions or crises may seem more subtle, less noticeable, but they are very real. We will focus here on the periods of middle adulthood and late adulthood. We are familiar with the idea that middle age starts around 40 and that we become seniors at about age 65. We may not be aware of the psychological milestones that we need to negotiate during these periods. Erikson says that the task of middle age is choosing between generativity and stagnation. Another way of putting this is that we have a choice of becoming people who contribute and care for others in a positive, life-affirming way, or, if we do not successfully meet this task, then we can become self-centered, failing to contribute to society in a meaningful way. For most people, this stage of life is focused on work and family. In work, we demonstrate the competence and skills that we have been working on through our young adulthood. Now, in middle age, is our chance to blossom, to demonstrate all that we have learned and achieved and are now passing along and contributing to society. For people who have children, the focus is on the monumental task of raising healthy, functioning children to adulthood. It is the task of nurturing, supporting, and guiding children, raising the next generation of society that is the focus on this stage of life for many people, along with developing a solid career and job skills. The failure to negotiate this crisis may lead to stagnation, a sense of being stuck, afraid to risk, afraid to take responsibility for our choices. The next stage, mature adulthood, brings a different and final set of challenges, the last developmental crisis. Here, Erikson says that the choice is between integrity and despair. As we reach a point where we know we don't have many years left, the crisis is determining what our life has meant. Have we been true to our values? Have we contributed to society, helped our family and friends, made a difference in some small way in the world? These basic questions of meaning may lead to some difficult soul-searching, to re-evaluating some of the choices we have made, the things we have and have not accomplished. But if we fail to look at those issues, then Erikson says we run the risk of despair, of thinking that we have come to the end of our life without a strong sense that our life has had integrity and meaning. We see how this theme of orientation, disorientation, new orientation is reflected in these developmental stages. As we navigate the crisis of each stage, accomplish the tasks that are required for our appropriate age, we spend time at a place of orientation, a time and place in our lives where we are settled. We feel like we are doing what we need to be doing, where life makes sense. But if we are growing, open to the challenges of each stage of life, we don't stay there. At life's transitions, we go through a stage of disorientation. Our old ways of understanding ourselves, our roles, our life tasks begin to lose their meaning. They don't fit anymore. This phase of disorientation is what Erikson would call a developmental crisis, an invitation to further growth, to come to the next stage of maturity. Then, as we make this transition, as we move into the next phase of life, we come to a point of new orientation. In this place, the memory of what has gone before us, the recent crisis, time of transition and struggle, is still very present, very real. It is perhaps this consciousness, this memory of what has gone before, that marks the key difference between secular psychology and the stance of faith. For Erikson and other developmental psychologists, there is little emphasis on remembering the previous stage. Development is seen as fairly linear. Progress is understood primarily as a straight line. In a faith perspective, however, maturation is understood to be more cyclical. Each new stage or place carries with it the memory and reality of the previous place. The idea that we move from orientation to disorientation to new orientation is something that we can see across the course of our lives and also see echoed throughout Scripture. We know that the two biggest events in Scripture are the Exodus in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the Paschal Mystery, that is, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. These two events are models that are echoed throughout Scripture. The Hebrew people understood themselves and their faith primarily in terms of the great passage from slavery in Egypt through the long process of escaping Egypt into the final freedom of the Promised Land. In the Paschal Mystery, we see the movement echoed in the life of Christ, from his life and incarnation to his passion and death, and then finally the resurrection. In each of these events, we see a movement from ordinary, stable life to having everything turned upside down, and then eventually life coming to a new point, a new reality. When we look at the Exodus story, we see not only the linear historical journey out of the slavery of Egypt, through the desert of testing and doubt, to the land promised by God, but we also see this event commemorated over and over in the faith life of Israel. This movement of orientation, disorientation, new orientation is commemorated at Passover every year. Every year, the memory of the entire journey, the entire experience, is made new in the celebration of Passover. In the same way, Christians celebrate the Paschal Mystery as something that is not simply historical, but is always present. In faith, we see that we do not move in linear stages through our life, but our faith grows as if in a spiral. Throughout our lives, throughout the liturgical year, we celebrate the times of orientation, the settled places of awareness of God's presence, the life and teaching, the incarnation of Christ. In the times of disorientation, we grapple with the reality of the Passion, the suffering and death of Jesus, our times of suffering, loss, doubt. But we always come again, once again, to the resurrection, to new orientation, when the memory and reality of disorientation is still fresh, but now we can recognize new life, the power of God working in our life anew. Now, in our next session, we will take a further look at what progress on this journey means.